Yeah.
We're live!
We're live. Oh, wow.
So hi everybody. This is the Paper Towns Fandom Forward team, the lovely team behind assembling our beautiful toolkit. My name is Janae. I'm the chapter's director. So I got the pleasure of working with this team a little bit in trying to figure out, what the biggest issues were that we should tackle. And somebody should mute. I think. Yeah. So I'm trying to figure out where our feedback is.
Muting everyone.
I think it was Becca.
Oh, it's probably Josh.
I was like,
He's
I could
playing
not
a video
figure
game
it
with
out.
constant clicking.
Okay, so now that we have uncovered the ghost mystery, let's see here. Okay, so we are going to go ahead and start with homelessness and youth runaways. Okay, I figured it out. There was a ghost in our live stream, and everything should be beautiful now. So, ghost vanquished. Sound now beautiful.
You thought this was Paper Towns, but it was actually the X-Files.
We became the X-Files live stream for a moment. Maybe we became a paper live stream is what happened. So the first issue that we tackled in our toolkit was the homelessness and youth runaways issue. So I thought we would go ahead and start with that one. So how this will work is we'll just kind of open up and see what questions or observations or feelings that anybody had that wants to go first. And then also if anybody has any comments for the chat room, we'll be checking those out too. But so how did you all feel with the movie adaptation? How did you think it represented that issue? And does anybody have some kind of like initial opinions?
Well, I thought one of the most striking things in the book regarding that issue was that when Q and his crew come and find Margot, she's actually, she's not living this glamorous life. She's using a gas station bathroom and living in this old abandoned house, and it might seem glamorous that she's now living in a paper town, and the road trip itself might have been interesting and fun, but that actual part of her life is not what he imagined it to be. And in the film, I thought while some of that was conveyed, it was also, it was a lot more cinematic. That's not the way that I wanted to say that. She was still beautiful, and her eyebrows were perfect, and she looked like she was wearing perfect makeup, and we didn't know anything about what she was actually doing there. We just saw her in the nearby town just going about her mystery still. And so I thought there were certain elements of that issue that were conveyed, but not nearly to the extent that they were in the book.
Something that I really enjoyed was in regards to Margot running away and how she's done that like multiple times. was when her mom was talking about Margot running away, and she was saying, like, oh, she's just doing it for attention, she'll come back when she needs money. And I think that that was a very honest light that was shed on, like, how sometimes parents have the attitudes that parents have towards runaway children. And I really appreciated that bit of realism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although that was another thing that we missed in the film, a lot of the police visits to Q and Margot's family, and where the policeman talks about, I don't remember the exact quote, but about how she, like, drifts away. And so that was something that I found really touching in the book that we didn't quite see in the film.
Another thing I found is that it was even less specific about what was going to happen to Margot once he left her in the town. And I think that's something that always really worries me, because it's like, oh, okay, she'll be fine, but she doesn't really have anything.
Mm.
And I thought that was quite interesting that they just kind of glossed over that. Like, Margot will look after Margot.
Yeah, it was definitely like I felt like they were really trying to bring home the message of, like, Q shouldn't have the rights to, like, tell Margot's story for her. And I appreciated that angle of it. I felt like that was something that maybe wasn't as present in the book, and was made a really big deal in the movie. But kind of in the process of that, they did almost, like, gloss over the reality, like you're saying, and like Autumn was saying about you know, what she's actually dealing with, because they were so, like, against kind of telling more of her story for her. So that was kind of an interesting, like, you added something but also took something away in the process. And so we also have Mary in the chat, and so I just want to highlight what she's saying, that the movie gave the vibe that if you're a teenager and run away on your own, everything will be 100% fine. And I think that's definitely what a lot of us felt from it.
Yeah, because no one was freaked out for Margot in any sense. No one was, like, worried about her, especially toward the end. Like, Q wasn't, like, concerned about where she was going to go or what was going to happen to her. I think there was, like, a particular thing he said toward the end, which was, whatever she's doing, I know it's amazing. And that, it almost completely kind of, it took away from him trying to picture her as a fully realized person, because, oh yeah, whatever she's doing, it's going to be amazing because she's Margot Roth-Spiegelman. It's like, it could have been like, whatever she's doing, I hope she's happy, or I hope she's safe, or I hope she's okay.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting point about that, how that almost dehumanizes her in a different way.
I guess that's a flaw of the character, though, that we have to understand. Like, he is still just a teenage boy, so his understanding isn't amazing. The only problem is then that reflects what other people in the world may understand, because it's so known and so popular.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were two younger girls behind me coming out of the theater, and I was talking to Josh, because obviously we went and seeing this movie with that idea, you know, like, this is what this is and what I'm looking at it, and there were a couple of teenagers behind me that were very like, oh, I wish I could be Margot. And there was something just really sad about that in that moment, because walking away from the movie, there's not a point where I'd envy what Margot goes through. And I guess I also just don't think Margot may be a really great person, which I think we see in her treatment of Lacey and stuff. But I think if you walk away from the movie and you're like, I want to be Margot, like, I want to run away from my home, and I don't understand all the implications that come with that, and, like, what does being homeless mean and what does a runaway mean, I think, like, it's really easy to glamorize that you end up in this small town in New York and you write all the time and you fit right in, whereas obviously I'm pretty sure if you ended up in that small town in real life, you'd probably be a sore thumb, if that makes sense, because there's maybe 2,000 people. And so I guess there's a lot of, I think Sophie brings up a really interesting point about, because we see, there's a flaw in Q as a character, and he seemingly learns his lesson while also not learning his lesson because of those last lines, but I also think it's like really problematic that I think a lot of people may have walked away from the film in a way that maybe they didn't walk away from the book, with this really like wanting to be Margot, like loving the myth, loving the legend, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
I also felt like a certain part of that story was, I don't know if this was just me kind of projecting as well, but like it felt like a certain part of that story was specifically that high school senior leaving for college kind of thing, which is of course Q's story and not really Margot's, but that idea of leaving what you know and going off into the unknown, and how it's exciting and interesting but also sad, and that is Margot's story too, but we don't see quite as much of it in the way that's really, we don't see the negatives to it the way that we see it for Q, because it isn't as close to life there. Like the idea, we definitely see the story of somebody who leaves high school and then doesn't go and follow the traditional path, but we don't romanticize it the same way that we do for Margot, and so those stories feel very separate from one another.
Yeah.
I don't know, but that was interesting for me to watch the film as someone who's kind of going off into that same part of life that Q and his friends are in now. Just the very different way that is shown in a very, like, it seemed very nostalgic for that time of life, which is not really what I am experiencing currently.
Awesome. Any other thoughts about like homeless and stuff that came up at all? I mean, I felt like it was pretty, like Margot's reaction to it was pretty the centerpiece of that subject, especially in the film version.
I did think one thing was interesting. Sorry, I started talking and then I was muted. But the thing that I thought was really fascinating, at least to me, was the way that like certain derelict, and derelict is not the kind of word I wanted to use, but like rundown areas were portrayed in the movie. And that's kind of, I think, tangential to the whole topic of homelessness, but very much in the kind of way that we view and we talk about, like, I know we'll get into this later, but talking about the homeless and the way that like language is used and the way that like their living situation is portrayed or something like that. That idea of that derelict abandoned building where there was like obviously things from people had been living there at some point. And while that's obviously not directly related to the main character storylines that we heard, I thought it was interesting that Margot ends up going there, that's where she leaves one of the clues, and even the way that that's cinematically presented, I think, can be very starkly different from the books. And I think another way you see that is it's way different to represent something cinematically than narratively, right? And I think The Hunger Games would be also another example of where the cinematic thing has packed so much more of a punch because of the visual element to it. And I think you really can see that in some of the cinematography of Paper Towns, both when they go to Agalo and they're looking at the old general store and kind of that whole like rundown, abandoned nature that I think often gets like associated with the idea of homelessness and the idea of runaways, and not even thinking about other types of homelessness. There's like chronic homelessness, which is what we most often associate, but there's so many people that are always temporarily homeless, and I think, personally I've learned a lot because DC is basically one of the most largest centers for homeless populations, and there's just so many different ones. So it's interesting to see that cinematically presented. Whether or not it's a good or a bad thing to the issue, I think, is an interesting discussion, but it was fascinating.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay. So let's kind of transition a little bit in talking about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl. and how that kind of played out in the movie. I have a couple thoughts, but I want to see if anybody else has thoughts first.
Yeah, I think this was really interesting, especially hearing just then that Becca heard girls saying, "Oh, I wish I could be Margot," because I guess I never thought that at all, but at the same time, you have her played by, one of the top supermodels in the world, so she looks gorgeous on screen and she is mysterious and she is fascinating, and you just want to know like all the facets of her life, and I guess that is really dangerous, and I'm really glad that in the movie they probably showed Radar's girlfriend and Lacey a bit more than in the books, because it kind of, I guess, gave us some more strong female characters in a book that is primarily about three boys' journey, and I think there's nothing wrong with that either. It's nice to have, strong male characters as well. But yeah, I think it's interesting because that is such a big part of the book that even he thinks that she's something she isn't, and he realizes that's wrong. So yeah, it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so I am going to admit that I had not read the book in a long time, and so I kind of forgot that Angela wasn't in the van in the book. So that's interesting. I definitely agree with all that. I think my biggest thought, even while I was watching the movie, that I felt like they made a much bigger point about the Manic Pixie Dream Girl stuff with Lacey and Angela than was present in the book. Like, both of those characters kind of became also reflections of Margot, which I thought was really interesting. So, with Angela, she was portrayed in the beginning, only through Radar's conception of her as being this really of course she's not going to want to go along with this plan, and of course she's not going to get along with his friends, and she's not going to be into a road trip, and then it turns out that she's a lot more complex than that and more adventurous than he thought she was. And they kind of did a similar thing with Lacey. I thought Lacey was a little bit less that was a more kind of stereotypical hot girl is actually cool and likes Charizard, which was not quite as a nice representation as what they did with Angela, but I definitely picked that up personally.
I think, and they're all foils to each other. So you have Angela and Lacey both being foils to Margot. I think one of the most striking points to me, at least, when in talking about female friendships, was how much Lacey cared about Margot, right? She goes after Margot and she puts that in. But on the other end, it's not able to, that it's not reciprocated. I mean, there are some issues with Margot as a friend, and that's nothing to say about people imagining her complexly or the idea that we need to see all people as fully fleshed out human beings, but that Margot may not have been a perfect person, and Margot probably did some really crappy things to people and that kind of thing. And so I think that was really interesting, or that she would assume that her best friend would have known that her boyfriend was cheating on her with her other best friend, which sounds very complex in that way. But I also think that all of the girls represented foils for the guys in the movie, and kind of, Margot versus Q, and that idealization that happens both ways versus that stark reality of what it means to be that person and have that kind of role. And Ben, the kid who always wants that hot girl, but then realizes, there's a lot more to it than that. And then also, I think Radar and Angela, I think, were really interesting in that I feel like Angela was more fully fleshed out as a character in the movie, but also just in general, he's so dainty with her. He doesn't want the guys talking to her. He doesn't want anything happening because he doesn't want to ruin this relationship that he views as perfect. And then you find out she's definitely able to handle that and capable of those interactions. So I saw a lot of characters playing off of each other to highlight, their complexities, but also their flaws.
I'm really curious about what you guys think about the fact that they put Radar and Angela, having sex together for the first time into the movie, because that wasn't really mentioned in the book at all. Um, because, it's really interesting. Obviously, it's very normal for teens to be sexually active, and I don't have any problem with them showing that, but I did think it was interesting that they just kind of threw it in there on the side. Everyone was there. It was on the road trip. Um, and then and the fact that, yeah, I don't know, they kind of saw those characters as more cool afterwards. I thought that was quite interesting.
Mm.
That it kind of changed how they, like, I don't know, I felt as though it kind of changed how the characters saw them a little bit. I was just wondering how everyone else felt about that scene.
Well, something interesting that Dan brought up, he can't be here right now, but he asked me to say a couple of things. He mentioned that he felt like having Angela in the van for the road trip might not have been so much to further explore her character, rather than a narrative excuse for her and Radar to have sex, and then for it to be discussed in the movie. So I thought that was kind of an interesting way of looking at it, that she was specifically there to allow that to happen, and then for that to be a part of the film and the associated jokes about it, and like the way that Radar changes as a character, the way that they see Radar differently as well.
Mm-hmm. I think I'm a little, it had some of the problematic, like, typical elements of, the teen movie where they are definitely kind of seen as, like, a little bit cooler afterwards, and that's not great, but I did kind of like that, they had this plan, and the whole prom venture seemed very much like kind of Radar. He had a lot of ownership in that. He's planning like all these different dates, and he's figuring out the time, and he's so like worried about it. And by like having that happen more organically and kind of on like what I read it as more on like Angela's terms. It was her just kind of deciding that that was the time instead of this like big setup they had. Was kind of a cool depiction to me. It made it less of an event and more of a just like, yeah, we're in a committed relationship, and Angela decided it was cool. And then, the way that she and Lacey were kind of low-key about it afterwards was nice to see too. But definitely the guy's typical reaction and the kind of treating it as them being cooler was on the downside of that, I would say, for sure.
To add to the thought of Angela only being there as like sort of a vehicle for the sex thing, I think I disagree with that. This is sort of just kind of random off the top of my head thoughts, but I really liked her being there in the sense that her and Radar getting closer because of that, and the whole like setup of that starting with her figuring out about like the Black Santa collection was really nice, because it allowed for him to be like, oh, okay, so she knows this really weird thing about me now. She thinks it's okay. She thinks it's funny. It's totally fine. And so it allowed for them to grow closer to each other, and so in a sense kind of reflect everyone else's like separate journeys with their romantic interest of choice. They were able to see each other as more human, I think, because of that. And I think it just brought them closer together and added to the seeing each other complexly theme of everything. Mm-hmm.
I want to ask about the kind of the final scene, or not quite final scene, but the final scene with Q and Margot in particular. because I think like that's what I've seen the most stuff about from other people, and it's kind of the like crux of the entire book. And it played out potentially a little bit differently on screen than it did in the book, where Margot finds Q there, or Q finds Margot. Do we have any like thoughts about how that was depicted?
One thing I found really interesting was a few days after I'd seen the film, I was speaking to one of my mum's friends actually, whose younger daughter had went to see it, and she was saying how she thought Margot was really horrible as a character. She treated him really meanly, and she was even worse in the book. Like, she was going on a massive rant about it, and I thought that was really interesting because I never saw Margot as a mean character. I saw her as immature and perhaps quite self-centered, but I never thought she was vicious in any way.
Yeah,
I thought that was fascinating.
That's really interesting because I definitely would not like. My interpretation of her in the movie was definitely not mean to him when he gets there, so that's really fascinating.
Yeah, she's actually much kinder than she is in the book. Whereas in the book she just like she's very upset that he's there, whereas in the film she seems more surprised and glad but unwilling to go back with him. In the book, from what I remember, she's like very angry with him, which is that seems justified to me.
My perception of, I think that's the right word, but how I perceive Margot is actually a little bit different. I think she's a little confused. She does not know who she does not know who to be. She's with a bunch of, how do I word this? Should have thought about this before I actually started saying stuff. I'm sorry. But
You're fine.
like how society perceives people, if that makes any sense. Like, she's just thinking about how people think of her. Like, I don't think she really knows who she is, and she's trying to discover it. And I don't really think she's egocentric or anything, or self-centered or anything like that. I think she's just confused mainly, and she's trying to find out who she is. Curious and confused, if that makes like the least bit of sense at all.
Yeah, it does, totally.
I definitely agree in that sense that even towards the end, I don't know if this is a flaw in sort of Cara Delevingne's acting, but I felt towards the end, even Margot was still kind of trying to play to Q's idea of her, or I don't know if it was just the way she was speaking, because she has this like very like low, like mysterious kind of voice. But even towards the end, I still didn't fully get the idea that she had let a bit of her guard down with Q, and that she was still thinking to herself, this is what he thinks of me, this is who I am, this is who I'm supposed to pretend to be. But I definitely agree that she's very confused in that sense, and she plays towards what people want. She plays towards the idea of what people think of her, but it didn't seem quite as broken down and in the end as it could have been.
Right.
I guess my like one question is that her own anger in the book and like her almost like amusement in the movie, I guess, is like one of the ways I would strike that emotion. Seemed really, it was almost infuriating to me when, you know, he's like, when Q says, you know, you left all those clues, and Margot's like, to say that I was okay. And while you could totally take it that way, I think Margot had never presented herself as anything other than follow the clues and figure out the mystery. Does that make sense? So it becomes really difficult for me to be like, oh, of course, she just wanted him to know she was okay, when she could have written a note that's like, yeah, I'm okay. And I mean, that maybe that's not her personality, but I think you come into this interesting contrast when, you know, you mention like how much is she playing into the idea of what Q thinks of her, and, you know, being angry when someone comes to find you because you left without any clue and they're worried about you, and obviously that doesn't describe all of Q's motivations. And obviously he had a different thought about what it is, but I do think it's hard to like guess people's intentions, and if like you had always played these clues to do other things, then I guess like I would assume as well is that like these clues led to something bigger, something grander. And obviously that's a mistake of the idea of the manic pixie dream girl trope, but it's also, I think, a really frustrating part of Margot's character that you would even leave any sort of those ideas of clues and then get angry when someone found you using the clues that you had left, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I definitely, I get what you're saying. That makes sense to me. I think kind of that's an interesting like take on it, because when I first read it, I do think like the book does a good job of you feel bad for like Q, and you really empathize with Q, and understanding like why he's upset. And it's not that Q really doesn't have like any justification for doing what you're saying and like assuming that this is a bigger mystery, but I think that's actually one of the kind of brilliant pieces of the novel, is that it encourages you to treat Margot like a manic pixie dream girl in the same way that Q does, and kind of leads you into that trap almost. And so like you're almost supposed to be angry at the situation with Q, is how like I felt or understood it when I read it, and kind of like have to have that jarring experience of like taking yourself out and being like, oh, actually, when you think about Margot from her perspective, like, yeah, that's different. I think that's kind of like, I don't know, for me that's like one of the ways that it forces you to think about the issue more, is by kind of like tricking you into doing it yourself. Was like how I read it.
Yeah, I absolutely think that's true.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful point, and I think that really speaks to how great John Green is as a writer, that he can make you really feel like you're part of it. And I think another thing I thought was interesting was when you just said, because I agree at first when she said, I just wanted you to know that I was okay, I was like, I was angry with him. I was like, are you kidding? Why was like, what makes you think that would make him think that? But then I guess she's such a theatrical character, and she's quirky, and we learn that through, you know, the things that they do when she finds out her boyfriend's cheating. Most girls would probably scream a little bit and cry, but they wouldn't necessarily make this big plan, which is kind of brilliant, I think. But yeah, I guess it really speaks to her as a character, and I don't think we understand her as a character, so it's fair that we're shocked by how she thinks, because we never learn how she thinks.
Okay, well, I'm glad I'm not like totally losing it for having read it that way. I was afraid maybe I was the only one who was tricked by John Green, but alas, that's not the case. Okay, other thoughts on other things that came up with the dreaded MPDG?
There was this post I found that was saying, oh, happy birthday, Kara, blah blah blah. It was saying, well, you're our miracle, and the whole thing was that Margot was, at first she was like, oh, she's my miracle, but by the end that was just a huge, like, that's kind of dehumanizing her by characterizing her as a miracle, and that's it was just, so I got all mad about that. But thing is, if we're gonna, I felt like maybe, I mean, it could be, I felt maybe, I forget which part of the movie I felt, but I felt like she was still a miracle. Like, at the end, it was like, she's still a miracle. I'm like, why?
Yeah, I definitely got that sense too, like the whole, whatever she's doing, it's amazing, and, you know, still kind of playing up. It almost felt like the movie like went backwards a little bit. Like it made the point, and then it kind of, I don't know, it cheapened it a little bit for me with those final scenes.
John actually, he was talking about how in interviews, he would often get asked, "What's your miracle?" Which just, I think, goes to show how how misinterpreted the story could be to those who don't look into it deeply enough, as far as like interview media people. He'd be frustrated with that question each time he was asked it, and like at the beginning he would explain, well, actually, the idea of seeing someone as a miracle is in fact not what I'm trying to say at all. And he would like try to explain everything, but at a certain point it just kept getting asked so much that he'd be like, oh, my miracle is my wife, and then he would just like quickly move on from that. So yeah.
That's really interesting.
Wasn't that the same article that I think was really interesting? I think that was the defense of Kara when she went off at that reporter. And I think going into that, I think a lot of the press junket around it, especially reading like John Green's stuff about his anxiety that came out this week surrounding the press junket and that whole idea, because I can't imagine that's really that obviously is very stressful. But, you know, Kara flippantly went off at a reporter when they asked her, like, if she had read the book. And apparently, you know, John made it clear that everyone had said, and I think when you're talking about representations of women and getting back to the issue, that it was really just funny how it was replicated in kind of that press junket, right? So, you know, they'd ask her if she read the book, and they'd ask Nat when he read the book. And the idea, even that language and that difference about maybe she read it and maybe she didn't, and maybe that's like, and so for her, that's like was really frustrating. And it's also fascinating because having read interviews with the actress, she's just such an open book in some ways, and so does not want to obviously be seen as this mystical creature, you know, this unicorn of sorts. And I think that becomes really interesting when you look at things like press junkets and other places where we can really see those media representations of women. We see it all the time when female like movie stars or actresses are asked things that their like male counterparts or others would never be asked. And I think like even the idea that, you know, Kara wouldn't read a book because she's a model or whatever, like the ideas and the idea behind that I think becomes really prevalent, and it makes it really easy to like say something flippant or to, as John, you know, pointed out, like go to an answer instead of having to explain the more complicated version of things.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to say that basically the whole point of this was to had it sit in my mind, but the whole point was to imagine people complexly, and we can't even imagine, like, if we're still using them, and the press is like does not even imagine people at all complexly, like they just go for stereotypes, and that's kind of really sad because people are more than what they seem. You can't just look at them and see, like, guess where you can, but that's not the right thing to do because you don't know a person unless you imagine them complexly, put them in your own, or you go in their shoes, or basically I felt that was kind of a slap in the face based on how the whole idea was trying to find out how to do that, and that was
that is one things. Yeah, that is one thing I loved about the movie, though, because when I left, I did spend some time thinking about the people over the years that I have seen as, you know, not necessarily seen them for them, but seeing them for how everyone expects them to be, or how, you know, they're perceived by, you know, your school or, you know, your group of friends. And I thought about them more as a person and not as the ideas that they had become. So I think it definitely did work in that sense.
That was so beautiful, Sophie.
I agree.
For sure. I love all of that, and I think that is a really good segue into kind of talking about what was kind of the like capstone of our toolkit, I would say, is how issues like homelessness and like Manic Pixie Dream Girl and, you know, a lot of the issues in kind of social activism work all relate back to this idea of dehumanization. And, you know, one of the things that we suggested in our dehumanization section was our positive fandom guidelines. And there's a particular line in here in our guidelines that I have really loved the entire time we've been working on them, and that is that idolization and demonization are both forms of dehumanization. And I think that's just really resonant in how we've been talking about how the press junket is going and thinking about people like John and Kara and how these issues kind of play out not just within the text of the media that we're looking at, but also the people surrounding those media and fandom. So yeah, that was just like, it's a line that's been on my mind for most of this process because I think it's so relevant. But did we have other in general thoughts about dehumanization and maybe other ways that, you know, people had similar experiences to Sophie or other things that came up in the movie?
On a related note, with dehumanization, I'd like to bring up the with the rumors of the Bloody Ben stories and how you can twist the truth so much that it becomes something that it's not. As I'm trying to search the book for a specific quote and think about the movie at the same time, but how it's weird how it was just a kidney infection, honestly, and you turn that into something that it's totally not, and it's well. And how fast the rumors can spread and everybody believes what they've heard and the truth is just diminishes into nothing. It's just dust.
Yeah, the Bloody Ben thing was an interesting, like, I hadn't actually thought about that in the dehumanization context, and that's a really, like, nice kind of side plot in the story that plays into that.
What was really what I think was really awesome, first off, like, just Nat Wolff's performance in this, in general, was just absolutely awesome, and I love how he also extended his, like, dehumanization, like, his mindset to his friends. I think one of them said at one point, they were talking about how this isn't as important to any of us as it is, like, to you. We have other things on our plate. We have other things that we need to focus on. And he treated them as sort of like, well, why aren't you caring about this as much as I do? Obviously, this is just the most important thing that's going on right now. And he, in searching for Margot, forgot about his friends and their feelings and their separate wants and their separate needs, and treated them during that process of looking for Margot as just, like, lackeys to kind of help him out. And I don't think either towards the road trip or when they were Pokemon, he, like, remembered, oh yeah, I really love these guys and they're not just here to, like, help me find this girl.
Yeah, absolutely. Radar had a really great line, like exactly what you're talking about, his whole blow up with them. But I think he said it was, like, along the lines of, it's okay if we're different people. I thought that was a really interesting, like, friend line.
I agree with that line. I'm going to stare back, though, into the dehumanization thing because I kind of found something that I wish was in the movie, but it's in the book, and with how the seniors treat the freshmen and how upperclassmen to lowerclassmen and all the things that go wrong, how they're running over the bikes and the water guns and everything. I feel like I would have liked to see Q stick up to them. It would show kind of how a bystander has the power to help out the victim, but that kind of wasn't included, and I was a little disappointed with that.
Yeah.
We do see Q stand up to bullies a little bit, but it's kind of iffy, too. Like, the only way that he knows how to stand up to someone who is going to hurt him is with blackmail, and that's, you know, not amazing, but...
Yeah, there was some weirdness with, like, I don't know, I think I got extra... I don't know what I want to say. I think it's different when you're, like, I'm looking back on how he is blackmailing, God, I don't even remember his name, the ex-boyfriend with, like, his naked photos and how inappropriate and really sad that is. And I think it's interesting, when you look back on those kinds of things, how like more unsettled I was by that now than I probably would have been if I had been watching this movie, like, as like a freshman in high school or something like that.
There could have been a way better approach to fix the issues that happened, but I feel that I'd rather have some approach better than nothing. But it's not like the right approach. You can't. Two wrongs don't make a right, and basically he's kind of doing like, I'm not saying that he is a little bit wrong, Hugh, by doing that to Jason, I think is his name, but I feel he is a bit wrong when he does that. But I like how he's standing up. At least he's protecting them. If there was a better way to show protection and to like show that bystanders have the power to protect the victims and to help out, then I really would have liked that even more.
I guess this really plays into the whole dehumanization because I think we really dehumanize. Well, I know I did. Margot's ex-boyfriend, because when that scene was playing, I just, like, I'm not gonna lie, I enjoyed it. I thought it was funny. But thinking about it right now, that kind of shocks me because if you think about, okay, let's say one of your friends or someone you're close to was blackmailed by a nude picture that was taken without consent, you would be very horrified and upset, to say the least. So I think that's interesting in itself. That whole notion really goes with all the characters in this book and movie.
I think it's really easy to, talk about rehumanizing the people who we view as like traditionally good in the, whatever, when you're talking about good or evil and those kind of binaries. But I think it comes much harder, like what you guys are saying, it comes much harder when you have to humanize somebody who you don't traditionally see as like a good person, like a bully, or you can talk on much larger scales as well. But it becomes a lot more difficult. But it's like probably one of the most crucial parts of the impacts of dehumanization, because you don't realize you can become a bully if you dehumanize yourself from the bully. And I think they talk a lot about that in the book with Chuck. I believe his name is Chuck. And I think that only continues, right? The idea that Q views this guy as someone else, and obviously like that of taking a new picture, he has one less eyebrow and it will grow back. But there becomes an issue where it's really hard to be like to humanize that person, but it becomes all the more important because you don't realize what systems you may or may not be participating in until you like are able to step in someone else's shoes or to realize like the misconceptions that may be happening about someone else, if that makes sense.
For sure, it definitely does.
That kind of brings up a question in my mind. Was this real? Was the whole revenge plot that Margot planned, was that really right of her? Was that really the right thing to do?
It wasn't right, and I don't think it was meant to be right. It was just very Margot. It was her one last sort of grand gesture before she left everybody, and it was also she was hurting, and I think trying to understand how she works, the only way that she could like heal that hurting was to make it into a big deal. So no, it wasn't right, but it was like in her eyes the right thing to do for like the pain that she was caused because of all of this.
Yeah, characters are flawed, and thank goodness for that, because, books and movies would be extremely boring if they always did the right thing, and unfortunately as people, we don't always do the right thing. So I think everyone, although I wish I could say when someone was mean to me, I just you know, thought, oh, that's fine, there's something going on in their life. I think secretly we all wish we could have done a revenge plot once in our lives. I'm hoping no one has actually done it, but I think we can understand where she's coming from. And, you know, I did say earlier that personally I see her as quite an immature character, and there's nothing wrong with that because she's still growing and she's still learning who she is. And, you know, I don't think she's reached that point where she's, you know, mature and thinks about things fully yet, personally. So it makes sense to me that, you know, she does just go crazy with it because that's who she is at this point of her life and that's how she feels.
Yeah, definitely. I think this book and like the character interactions are so layered. Like Margot does her fair share of dehumanizing her friends, really, and not really thinking about like what is going on with the rest of their lives. So like the deeper and deeper you get into all their relationships, I think it just, you know, they're all kind of headed back to that same point. So as we're kind of getting to the top of the hour here, you know, I think it's important to kind of end these streams as kind of the capstone of our whole process for, you know, each of our toolkits and our projects, and just thinking about, you know, how was the experience for you? What's maybe like, you know, something that you would really want people to like come away from the toolkit with, or what's something that you think you're gonna like continue to be aware of having worked on everything?
Well, for me, the experience was absolutely amazing. It was a chance to, I felt like I had a role in helping things for the better. I was bringing awareness, and I kind of liked that. I really do. I enjoyed it. It made me want to do much more like this, and it made me think critically about how things are.
Awesome.
Absolutely, an incredibly amazing experience, and I feel so like lucky that I was able to do it. And with anyone who is using the toolkit, anyone who comes back from it, I want that that sort of that idea that there are these deeper meanings within the pieces of media that you take in, whether it's movies or TV shows or books, that there are things to be analyzed, and there are things to be looked at, and there are things to be questioned, and there isn't any sort of thing you can like take in as far as like media goes that doesn't have the opportunity to be analyzed more deeply, and just being able to come back from using the toolkit with a deeper understanding of problems in society and ways that they can be solved, and ways that someone individually could work towards solving them. That would be amazing for people who have used the toolkit to come back thinking.
Awesome.
I think it's been a really amazing experience to work through these past two toolkits, because both toolkits, the Marvel Cinematic Universe and Paper Towns, though they both come from genres that are commonly associated as being strictly entertainment. We look at comic books and people think of comics as just something that's fun to read, and a lot of people associate young adult literature as just kind of like something that's just for kids, or something that is just kind of a fun read. And it's been amazing to go through these works, and to go through Paper Towns, which is a book that I hadn't put quite as much thought into as I had with some of John Green's other books. To go through these with people who really love them and care about them and have thought really closely about them, and to be able to go through and pull out a lot of meaning that I hadn't seen before, and know that other people would be seeing those and might not have thought about them in the same way and hear differing opinions. It's been really amazing for me.
Yeah, I felt like a small part of something really incredible, and it felt like such an honor to work with, this group of young people that all had so many ideas and thoughts and opinions that were really thought out, and yeah, and to bounce ideas back and forth with them was, it felt like something really special. And Paper Towns and John Green are definitely things, that I love in my life. I think John Green's incredible, and I really, what's the word? I really look up to him as a person. And I personally think that young adult novels and films are really important because they influence people at a really vital time of shaping who they're going to become. So I hope this toolkit can help, at least one person view the world slightly in a more thoughtful and in-depth way. And I think also another thing I really took from it was how important the issue of homelessness is and homeless youth in our society and how deeply we need to work on that. But yeah, I just wanted to thank you all so much because it was really great.
Yeah, I think you guys all did amazing. I also just wanted to say I think, Auden said these are two very different types of toolkits and also very entertainment one. And I think we had some challenges with this one. I know this one was a little more challenging in some ways. But I think what was really nice is, you get to work on a work by an author who is also constantly trying to improve himself as a human being. And I think that that's kind of, even that he would rethink these things. Or, for example, I'm sure if you guys read the dehumanization section, his use of the R word is not in the movie. SeaWorld's not in the movie. A bunch of, things have changed. I'm so sorry I interrupted somebody. But yeah. So I was just going to say, I think everyone did an amazing job at connecting really complicated issues, but also getting to work on this was, a much more interesting experience in some ways. And I'm so sorry for interrupting.
You're fine.
Is my thing working? Can you hear me?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I just wanted to say that I felt like, as a group, we were able to make better promotional material for the movie than the actual movie people. I don't know about you, but I was getting so frustrated with all the commercials, and I realized this is what they have to do, but, they emphasized the first half of the movie, which is completely different from, the ending of the movie, and which is the most important part, I think, because that's when all the lessons are learned. So I just thought that it was a good way to keep in mind what's important about the book and what makes it so special. And, just it was a good way to prepare for the film.
Definitely, yeah. Well, I am so glad that you all had a good time. This was a really, really interesting toolkit for me. Kind of similar to what Auden and Becca were both saying, in that, it was a book that I had read once and hadn't put as much thought into as other fandoms, and it was kind of cool to be on kind of the other side and really listening to and learning from people who are such huge fans of this and have put so much thought into it and really making me see it in a new way. So I have to thank all of you for agreeing to be consultants and spending time on this and creating such an awesome toolkit. I know that everybody on HPA staff has been incredibly impressed with the work that you all have done, and I think that this is going to continue to be a really awesome resource for people for a long while to come. So with that, I think it is time to conclude our live stream. Thank you all again, and thank you to everybody who has commented on and interacted with the toolkit. And I hope that we continue to see all the amazing things you do with it. Everyone want to say bye?
Goodbye.
I was waiting for all the beats to come on.
Goodbye.